Matthew 14:22-33. Jesus walks on the water. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against it. And early in the morning, he came walking towards them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you onto the water," he says. "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he noticed the strong winds, he became frightened and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You have little faith. Why do you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Good morning, Cameras friends. Thank you for having me with you today, and thank you for Matt for helping me prepare this message before he left on vacation, so no emails were exchanged during that time period. I don't want to get you in trouble. It has been great to be with you, even though I'm here in Indiana, and because I know that some of you are not here, are not in Washington State, I could also say good morning or good afternoon to the other East Coasters that are with me today. This time last year, I would be, as Matt said, calling you from DC because I worked at FCNL and ran the young adult program. And I know a few weeks ago you were joined in worship by my former colleague, Christine Ashley, who will now be joining Jade and I here in Richmond. So it is a kind of exciting adventure here at Earlham School of Religion. And as Matt mentioned, I moved to Richmond to attend Earlham School of Religion. But while I'm here, I also have a part-time job at the Earlham Science Commons Library. And my job is typically very simple. It's a technology library, so we check out laptops and lab notebooks. My job is primarily to make sure student workers show up on time and to fill in the spots if they've overslept or are delayed from a class. I work with faculty to ensure that they have, different technology needs and that they're fulfilled by the library. My job was pretty simple. But when the pandemic hit, I started working from home, primarily assisting with scanning needs and creating projects for student workers to be able to still make additional income during the pandemic. And this week, Earlham is reopening for in-person classes. And it has felt very strange to be back. There are colleagues I haven't seen in ages who have no idea what the last few months have been like for me in this isolation. My job has gone from simply making sure students show up on time to figuring out how all of the surfaces in the library are touched and how to make sure that they're sanitized in a way that's safe for students. And as I walk throughout campus, with my mask, of course, as per policy, I remember all the times I would walk with classmates to get coffee at the student-run co-op on campus. This co-op is no longer open because of the pandemic. I remember walking with a former partner late at night to write papers in the library because we both had procrastinated. The library is no longer open past 9 o'clock, and we can no longer sit at the same table even if it was because of different social distancing measures. Walking through campus feels like walking into a time capsule. The buildings all look the same from the outside, but I know from within the structures are different now. Very much like me. I may look the same to anyone who sees me, except now with the addition to a mask, the structures inside me are different too. I was prepared to take on the tasks of building safety protocols, to ensure our students can use technology safely. But what I wasn't prepared for was the grief that would come from the memories of the before, or in being confronted with the realities of the aftermath, the continued aftermath. And one part of this passage that stood out to me was the description of this disciples' boat. Now, months later into the global pandemic, it feels like we're on a boat, battered by waves, far from land, with the wind against us. This week, I confess, I didn't give myself enough time to process this new world around me. And in this hybrid world, I had to jump between Zoom meetings and in-person ones. So as I started preparing for this message on Monday, I went to one of the few places I can truly be alone, which was in my car in the Earlham parking lot. Spent a lot of time there eating lunch the last few days. And so I read the passage, which includes the familiar story I just read, but I didn't know how the chapter began. For those of you that don't have an encyclopedic memory of the Bible, like I don't, the Matthew 14 begins with the beheading of John the Baptist. And now in these days, it's not lost on me that in the world of 2020, that John the Baptist was killed by the state. And so we have Jesus, who is being told that John the Baptist has been beheaded. And so he decides to withdraw to a boat, to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard that he was in the area, they followed him. And this is where we get the other familiar Bible story, which was Jesus feeding the 5,000 people, limited fish and breads, and was able to give that food and food to people that were visiting. And our passage today starts after this story, this 5,000 people that Jesus fed after preaching to. Jesus tells the disciples to go ahead while he goes up the mountain alone. When I read the first chapter, I cried in my car, which is something that is a new seminary experience for me, crying over the Bible. Former Catholic. Bible knowledge is not always our strength. All I can see when reading it were all the times that Jesus is trying to get away to pray and the interruptions by others. And then after reading the full passage, I just became so furious at Peter. Here's a man, Jesus, the Son of God, but in human form, having just fed 5,000 people after trying to get away from a crowd, to be alone after hearing about the death of John the Baptist. Jesus then goes to join his crew back on the water, and Peter is the one who tells Jesus to tell him to join him on the water as a test of faith. And then when Jesus does this, Peter starts to doubt, and then Jesus has to save him. And I just want to say, come on, Peter, don't look down. Like, that's one more thing for Jesus to have to deal with. I was so frustrated at Peter in that moment. What resonated with me all of the times that I read this chapter was all of the periods that Jesus tries to be alone and can't. And it seems like there's always a miracle to do, or some way he has to reveal it or get people to understand that they should pay attention to their faith. He just has to keep going. Some people smarter than me would say that I'm reading myself into the text, which is often a warning sign that needs to be paid attention to. Jesus in this story reminds me of incredible grief. Grief that shows up like a ghost in the night when you aren't expecting it because the world around you is chaotic enough. Like the grief of a passing conversation buried in the walls of an academic building, remembered when walking through with a measuring stick of 6 feet, too busy to hear it whisper. Or grief popping up as you're trying to remember your Zoom password, and instead faced with looking out the window, remembering a different world instead. For many of us, the world is changing so rapidly that there isn't time to grieve. Or we know we are fortunate enough not to experience the massive horrors that others are facing, of bombings and brutalities and death. And so we constantly remind ourselves that it could be worse, instead of grieving the fact that we've been in this boat for way too long, and we're starting to feel a little seasick. For many of us experiencing grief, it is easy to turn to forms of numbing. And I find myself constantly trying to avoid this feeling of grief by adding more Zoom meetings to my already busy schedule. to keep my mind focused and forward instead of dwelling on the present. We all have our ways of dodging grief. It's a scary thing to accept, that dreading feeling of grief. I think about how afraid the disciples were on the boat. And many of us are very afraid right now. We are all afraid of what might happen. If you have the answers, I'm very curious, because I think universally it is a very scary experience because there's so much uncertainty right now. And grief and fear are natural friends in that way. I find that fear and grief is connected because I find that grief is often the release of fear. But in a world as uncertainty consistently exists like ours today, we might feel them simultaneously. What does it mean for us to embrace grief while actively feeling fear? And I'm generally an optimistic person. When I worked at FCNL, I was always the wrangler of parties and excitement, and we can do it. But boy, do I feel far from the shore. There's a Friends Journal article that I've read almost every week since 2018 when it was released by friend Emily Provence. And the piece is called "The Grief in the Promised Land." And in this piece, friend Emily starts her piece by encouraging readers to imagine a more inclusive and wider religious society of friends. She names the many ways our religious community can be strengthened by embracing gifts and natural gifts and encouraging people to go after their gifts. And she names and imagines a world where multiracial culture is at the center of Quaker culture and not white culture. Her vision for the religious society of friends falls very much in line with my own, and I craved the world that she describes. But she also acknowledges that major structural change is needed in order to get to the world we seek. And for those of us who've been working for social change for a long time, we know it is a long and hard process to get to where we need to go. There's often a lot of pain in transition. And Emily reminds us in her piece that grief is part of the world-changing process. She warns us in the piece that there are some pitfalls to not acknowledging and releasing our grief. And sometimes in friend circles, I hear things like, we're in the promised land because there is no racism within the Religious Society of Friends, or we don't have an age problem. Look at this beautiful FCNL brochure with all these nice young faces. We don't have any problems. We're doing it. We skip over the hard part of the transition and instead proclaim that we've already gotten there. Don't you see our Black Lives Matter sign on the door? Or we instead say we will never get there, so why try? And in today's context, it might look like no one's wearing a mask at my grocery store. So why even try to bother with quarantining anymore? We tried to put a Facebook ad up to encourage young people to come to our meeting and nothing happened. So it's useless to try. Or we think we'll get there by simply waiting for it. God will get us there. Humans have survived global pandemics before. Religious Society of Friends has had limited numbers and people throughout our history. We've been at 100,000 for a long time. We'll be there for a while. We'll be fine. But the truth is, these are stalling tactics in getting us to the promised land. Or in the story, back in the boat, to the shore. Emily asked the question, can we learn to treat grief like a part of our rebirth? And when I hear Jesus say, you have little faith, why do you doubt? I don't think he's saying everything will be fine if we let it, or just believe in him. I think the ability to grieve is a gift from God, and it is necessary to be part of our process. Perhaps we should take a note from our friend Peter, and we should name what we desire. Peter in the story names the desire to know Jesus. Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. We might feel reluctant to focus on our own grief by thinking of all the ways our to-do list keeps piling up, or worry about how grief will look to others. But we must not look down the path and not start accepting our grief. Our society, especially with this advancement of technology, makes it very tempting to keep moving on and pretending everything is okay. I know my phone and its very tempting apps will appear to be like a strong wind, causing me to doubt that grief is actually happening when I have, all these apps and all of these reasons and ways to connect with people. late at night, staying up late on Twitter or TikTok or social media because I'm feeling lonely and sad. And then the next morning, I am certainly further away from accepting grief because I'm so tired and worried about how far I've become on my to-do list. Perhaps our version of walking on water is the process of figuring out what we need to feel to grieve. Is it a phone call to a friend to speak out loud the sadness that has come from the changed world? Or is it spending a few extra minutes holding a pet extra close? Or is it spending some time making a playlist of songs that just allow you to be sad for a moment and sit there and look at the situation we're in and just grieve? If we take this into our personal practice, how can accepting grief help us in looking at structural problems? I know for me, the isolation of the moment can feel like it'll go on forever. So this week, when out of my mouth came the words, "I hate it here," suddenly, I was standing 6 feet away from a colleague of mine who asked me, appropriately, "You hate the library?" I'm like, no, I just want this to be over. I hate it here. And then we took a walk outside in silence. Feeling grief will not end the global pandemic. That's sadly not how science works. But the acknowledgement of grief may help calm the storm. We are still far from the shores, but in the end, we might still be able to be in the boat. And if we're in the boat, perhaps we will be with friends. Thank you, friends.
As we worship together through waiting and listening and savoring and ministering to one another verbally, if fitting and if led. I encourage you to let these queries that Katie has provided us guide you. What does embracing grief look like to you? What is holding you back from acknowledging grief? Or how have you been taking care of your grief related to